Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I see Steve Wolfbrand is here already. Hi, Steve. Nice to see you. Topic for tonight is neoliberals. Wrong on Social Security, inflation, and spending cuts. Why do I say that? Well, we're going to get into 3 articles tonight in some detail, and they will explain why I say that. Let's get into the first of these. By the way, we'll be joined by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends, in just a few moments. She's just winding up her show. So, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation asks, hang on a second and let me share this on Facebook. So I get some people. So I get a few more people to come to this. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which is always after Social Security, put up something on February 6, 2023, which is just sort of sitting around, and it appeared in my email just a day or two ago. And they asked the question, should we eliminate the Social Security tax cap? Here are the pros and cons. Now, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation is the epitome of a neoliberal institution. It was started with $1 billion or so from Peter G. Peterson, who was also the head of the International Institute of Economics when it published the Washington Consensus document by John Williamson. That is the foundation document for neoliberal policy in the international sphere. Was written in the late 80s in what was then the International Institute of Economics. It later became the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and that was in operation many years before he started the Peter G. Peterson Foundation with that $1 billion that he had earned through, I shouldn't say that he earned it. He unearned it through stock market activity. He unearned it. Anyway, here they ask the question, should we eliminate the Social Security tax cap? Here are the pros and cons. They're giving us the pros and cons. Now let's watch and let's see what pros, are eliminated from this and what cons are eliminated from this. Social Security is the largest program in the federal government, makes up almost 1/4 of total federal spending. It provides benefits to nearly 9 out of 10 individuals over the age of 65, or 15% of the American population. Without Social Security, research finds 2/3 of the elderly would be considered in poverty. And folks, that includes myself, and Bonnie. Without Social Security, we would certainly be in dire poverty. The program, however, is facing financing shortfalls, and its reserves are currently projected to be depleted in a little over a decade. At that point, unless Congress acts, it won't be able to pay full benefits to its beneficiaries. One potential solution for improving the program's financial output is increasing or eliminating the cap on earnings that are subject to Social Security payroll taxes. I notice Dee has arrived, so I will let her in.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Dee. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine too. We are right in the middle of an article from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation about the pros and cons of increasing the Social Security payroll tax. And of course, being the neoliberal organization they are, they're going to bias this article. Well, I don't know quite how they're going to bias this article, but we're going to see how they can bias this article. They surely will, because that's what they do. Okay, they're like the spider on the guy's back crossing the river, or the scorpion. It's not a spider, it's a scorpion. And the scorpion sticks the guy, and they both drown. And the guy says, "Why are you doing this? We're both going to drown." And of course, the joke is the scorpion says, "It's just in my nature." Similarly, it's just in the nature of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation to bias their articles. So our job is to find out where the bias is. Okay. One potential solution for improving the program's financial outlook is increasing or eliminating the cap on earnings that are subject to Social Security payroll taxes. Well, it doesn't give any other options, does it? In other words, another option here is just to fund Social Security with platinum coins every year.
Yeah.
We know how much it's going to cost approximately, in advance. So just mint the $1 trillion coin to cover it. That's all we got to do.
If they cared about the population, they would do that.
In fact, we could eliminate the payroll tax altogether and just find it with platinum coins.
Yes, we could.
And if that's going to be inflationary, well, we can trim the inflation by increasing income taxes on the rich. What about that? They're not going to discuss that here in this, I guarantee. What is the Social Security payroll tax? Federal Insurance Contributions Act taxes are the primary source of revenue for Social Security, and they're not the primary source of revenues for Social Security. They're the primary source of offsets for Social Security payments. The primary source, of revenues, the primary source of money for Social Security is the Congress appropriating the money and the Federal Reserve creating it by increasing the balance in the reserve accounts of the Treasury Department. That, my friends, is the absolute truth. The idea that FICA taxes are the primary source of revenues for Social Security is a fable. It is a myth, even though 99.99% of the population believes this myth. So, and the largest component of taxes that are commonly referred to as payroll taxes. Employers and employees pay 7.65% of wages in FICA taxes. The portion dedicated to Social Security is 6.2% and is only levied up to a maximum amount or income limit that is determined annually. The other 1.45% is dedicated to Medicare's hospital insurance program and is not subject to an earnings cap. That's nice to know, isn't it? I thought the whole thing was subject to an earnings cap. It's nice to know that the payments going to Medicare are not subject to an earnings cap. That at least is a little less regressive. Self-employed individuals also contribute to those funds, through the Self-Employment Contributions Act taxes. The rates for SECA taxes are identical to those for FICA taxes, with the only difference being that the individual is responsible for paying both the employee and employer portions of the tax. The limit on annual earnings to Social Security tax is referred to as the taxable maximum or the Social Security tax cap. For 2023, that maximum is set as $160,200, an increase of $13,200 from last year. When the tax dedicated to Social Security was first implemented, it was capped by statute at the first $3,000 of earnings, which would be equivalent to about $56,000 in 2021 dollars. Since 1975, the taxable maximum has generally been increased each year based on an index of national average wages. About 6% of the working population earns more than the taxable maximum. So that 6% then gets a break, because for anything above the 160,000, they don't have to pay anything into Social Security. Isn't that nice for them? Limit on earnings subject to Social Security payroll tax has risen over time. This is a graphic showing this, and you can see that it's at the 160,000 now. If it's increased by 13,000 next year, it'll be 173,000. 2 years from now, it will be over the 180,000, and they'll have to increase the size of the graph. What do you think of that? Individual income tax in the United States are generally progressive, with higher income taxpayers paying a larger share of their income in taxes. Low and moderate income individuals, though, pay a higher proportion of their income in payroll taxes than do higher income taxpayers. That's why I said it was regressive. In part, that situation stems from the existence of the tax cap for Social Security. For example, someone with a wage income of $67,000 per year would owe $41.54 for their share of Social Security taxes. However, someone with triple that income, or $201,000, would owe $88.54, which is just more than double the amount of tax. And here's a graphic, or some would call it an infograph, that shows that payroll taxes are regressive. There's taxpayer A, pays 6.2% as a percent of wages, even though taxpayer A makes $30,000. Taxpayer B makes $67,000, still pays the same percentage, 6.2%. Taxpayer C makes $201,000. Taxpayer C only pays 4.9%. What if taxpayer C were making $1 million? They would still pay $99.32, but of course the $99.32 would be what? I don't know, maybe roughly 1% of their tax of $1 million. Oh, very aggressive. What changes could be made to the tax cap? There have been a number of proposals to increase, eliminate, or otherwise adjust the payroll tax caps as a way to shore up Social Security finances. An example of one such proposal, the Social Security 2100 Act, would apply the Social Security payroll tax to earnings over $400,000, in addition to earnings below the current maximum taxable amount. The gap between the two would narrow over time as the maximum taxable amount increases and the $400,000 threshold remains unchanged. That gap has earned the nickname donut hole and would serve to gradually increase the program's revenues over time, while not subjecting earners who fall in the gap to immediate tax increases. While estimates vary based on assumed wage trends and the specific details of each proposal, economists project take approximately 20 to 30 years for the donut hole to disappear. Such an approach is intended to make the tax more progressive by increasing the tax burden on higher income Americans. And there's the infographic on what would happen if we lifted the Social Security tax gap. I'm not going to go through that. Another approach that has been proposed by economists is to set the tax cap as a portion of aggregate earnings rather than as a dollar figure. The proportion of total earnings that is subject to Social Security tax has declined over time because the earnings of the highest paid individuals have increased more quickly than those of other workers. In 1982, 90% of earnings were subject to the Social Security tax, but by 2017, the share had decreased to 84%. Setting a target for the portion of aggregate earnings that is subject to Social Security tax, for example, 90%, would increase revenues and help improve the program's solvency while making the tax more progressive. That helps to improve the program's solvency only under the assumption that Congress continues to appropriate the funds for the program. Congress need not appropriate those funds. Even if the taxes are collected, Congress need not appropriate the funds for the program. Or conversely, if the taxes that are necessary to make the payouts for the program fall short, it's still possible for Congress to appropriate all the funds that are needed to pay out fully Social Security benefits. It's about the appropriations, sucker. It's not about the taxes. Finally, a consideration when rising or removing the cap on taxable earnings is whether wages above the current cap would also be counted in the formula that determines benefits. Under current system, an increase in the cap would also raise benefits. 2023 maximum monthly benefit for people at full retirement age is $3,627, thereby leading to higher expenditures for the program, although those would be more than offset by higher tax revenues. Now, here are the pros and cons. Proponents of increasing or eliminating the limit on earnings argue it would make the tax less regressive and be part of a solution to strengthen the Social Security trust funds. As I've gone over in many other broadcasts, there is no trust fund in the sense that there's a bank account somewhere that contains the funds that the Treasury Department draws upon when it pays out the Social Security benefits. What there is an accounting record of how much the Treasury Department owes to the Social Security account. Okay, in other words, over a period of time, there have been bonds that were issued to the Social Security Administration. There are no bonds really. There's just an accounting record. Okay, there's a fixed amount of interest, okay, that's paid, and that's resulted in accumulation of funds, quote unquote, in the Social Security Trust Fund. But you have to understand the reality of the situation. There's no money there. It's always up to Congress appropriating the funds, and then the Treasury Department, through various manipulations, creating the funds, getting the Federal Reserve to create the funds that go into the Treasury spending account. For example, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that subjecting earnings above $250,000 to the payroll tax, in addition to those below the current taxable maximum, would raise more than $1 trillion in revenues over a 10-year period. Yet another argument is that removing the taxable maximum would adjust for increasing income inequality and the fact that higher income individuals generally have longer life expectancies and thus receive larger Social Security benefit checks for a greater amount of time. The opponents argued that increasing or removing the taxable maximum could weaken the link between the amount individuals pay in Social Security taxes and the amount they receive in retirement benefits if benefits are not adjusted upward to reflect tax contributions. The opponents also contend, of course, this, I think you can see transparently, that this link is not something necessary. What's necessary is that Congress appropriate the money always. What's at issue is whether the benefits, okay, uh, are adequate in order to produce an inclusive living for Social Security recipients, for those who are retired on Social Security. Right now, for many of the people who have retired on Social Security alone, that is not, an inclusive social payment for retired persons. Opponents also contend that while low-income earners may pay a greater share of their income Social Security payroll taxes than do those who are wealthier, they also receive a disproportionate share of government transfer payments that are not subject to the tax. These opponents cite programs have been created to at least partially offset the regressive nature of Social Security payroll taxes. Finally, high income beneficiaries may also be subject to income taxes on the Social Security benefits they receive. Again, these things are side issues. The issue is whether the benefits paid by Social Security are adequate for a socially uh, inclusive living. If they are not, the benefits need to be increased. They can be increased by the federal government at any time through congressional appropriations. And if it's a question of getting money into the Treasury spending account, it's always possible just to order the Federal Reserve to place the necessary money into the Treasury spending account, or, alternatively, the Treasury Department can mint platinum coins to cover the amount that has to be paid out. So, these opponents have been created to at least partially offset. I guess I read that already, so I'll skip that. And their Social Security benefits are based in part, on wages. For those who average earnings $24,191, their scheduled Social Security benefits are $13,562, which in America today is not enough to live on, obviously. I mean, I don't even think it's enough to pay rent in most cities here in the United States. For taxpayer B, whose average earnings $53,000, scheduled Social Security benefits at $22,374. For a single person, that may be sufficient to exist. It's not socially inclusive these days. Again, the cost of living in various areas of the United States, the cost of renting a place in various areas of the United States is going to exhaust that $22,000 very, very quickly. Taxpayer C, who earns $200,000 a year, gets $36,200 which of course is probably enough to live on for a single person in most places in the United States. But of course, taxpayer C, who makes the $200,000, does not need the $36,201. Does that person? Finally, some economists anticipate if the limit were lifted, employers and employees might respond by shifting taxable compensation to a form of compensation that is taxed at a lower rate. For example, employers could decrease wages but increase retirement benefits, which are deductible under the corporate income tax in an effort to offset the additional payroll taxes they would owe. Increasing or eliminating the Social Security tax cap is just one of many solutions for improving Social Security's financial outlook, but it's clear that some sort of action must be taken to ensure the future of this vitally important program. More options are detailed here. Let's see what those more options are. There's a longer report behind this. Retirement solutions. Let's see what they include. We've covered already payroll tax rate increase. Then there's the option to increase the retirement age and index it to increases in longevity. That, of course, is one that decreases Social Security benefits. Options to adjust the benefits, change the amount retirees can receive when they first apply for benefits. Many proposals combine a reduction in benefits for high earners with an increase in benefits for low earners. This is known as progressive price indexing. Slow the growth of retiree benefits over time by changing the cost of living index. Yeah, that was the chain CPI proposal of a few years ago. Very unpopular with people. So those are the only three options considered. The option of making higher congressional appropriations and funding it with either overt congressional financing, ordering the Fed to put the necessary reserves into the Treasury spending account, or with creating platinum coins to pay for it, not conceded by the Peterson Foundation. Why? Because the Peterson Foundation does not believe that money can be created by the federal government, or doesn't want you to believe that. So it doesn't mention that as a possible option. From their point of view, the only way the Treasury Department gets money is through tax revenues or through borrowing. They recognize no other source of money, in spite of the fact that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to coin money in unlimited amounts. Finally, what I want to say about this is, why do they want you to believe, or why do they appear to believe, that it is impossible for the government to actually create more money? It's because they're neoliberals. And because they believe in what Margaret Thatcher believed, and what Ronnie Reagan believed, that the state has no money of its own, that it's got to get reserves, not from the Federal Reserve creating those reserves, but from taxation, and from borrowing reserves through issuing bonds. So, those are the neoliberal solutions suggested by the Peterson Foundation, by the neoliberals in the Peterson Foundation. I'm saying they're wrong to restrict their solutions only to those few. It's their trick. When they do analyses, they usually consider a number of options all the time. But they don't consider options outside of those that are permissible under the ideology of neoliberalism. That is why, when it comes to looking at solving Social Security's problems, they're always wrong. They're wrong due to the incompleteness of their solutions. So next, I wanted to consider a recent piece by James Kenneth Galbraith, J.K. Galbraith, not his father, John Kenneth Galbraith, who of course is now deceased. Uh, this is a piece concerning inflation. And there's a picture of Jerome Powell that you're seeing right now, also known more familiarly as Jay Powell. The article is called Unpacking America's, quote, Soft Landing. And it was written on August 9th, published on August 9th at Project Syndicate. And it starts off with a little summary. From the inflation hawks who warned against government stimulus programs to the progressives who decried the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes, pretty much everyone has misunderstood recent U.S. macroeconomic indicators. To see what is really going on, we need to dispense with the defunct models and orthodox assumptions. This was written in Austin, Texas. So, Austin, back in 2021 and early 2022, a posse of prominent economists, I'm going to enlarge the type now so you can see it better, including Lawrence H. Summers, otherwise known as Larry Summers, Jason Furman, and by Kenneth Rogoff, all of Harvard, criticized the Biden administration's fiscal and investment program, pressured the U.S. Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. Their argument was that inflation fueled by federal spending would prove, quote, persistent, unquote, requiring a sustained shift to austerity. Unemployment, sadly, they said, would have to rise to at least 6.5% for several years, according to one study touted by Furman. By the way, Furman, if I'm not mistaken, used to be the head of the National Economics Council under President Obama. Larry Summers, of course, was the Treasury Secretary under Obama and was also chief economist going way back to the Clinton administration. Here's a photo of I guess that supposed to be a photo of infrastructure. Headline here is for that photo is Europe must lead Ukraine's reconstruction. Ken Rogoff urges the continent's governments to accept their historic responsibility to manage the post-war recovery. I don't know if they're going to recognize that particular responsibility, but I suspect that, if Russia puts forward the peace agreement, I think they're going to put forward that they may end up taking on the historic responsibility to manage the recovery, of Ukraine in the post-war period. Going further with the Galbraith article, however, while this trio and many like-minded commentators failed to sway the White House or Congress, they were in tune with Fed Chair Jerome Powell and his colleagues, who began hiking interest rates in early 2022 and have kept at it now for a year and a half. The Fed's very rapid monetary policy tightening soon prompted progressives, led by Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. I guess it's arguable whether she's very progressive, to fear that it would trigger a recession, mass unemployment, and no, they didn't say it, a Republican victory in 2024. I think prospects are looking good for a Republican victory in 2024, though they'll probably decrease the chances of that victory by running Donald Trump again. But the macroeconomic situation has confounded both positions. Contrary to those advocating austerity, inflation peaked on its own in mid 2022, owing partly to sales from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. There was no persistence, no surge from the 2021 fiscal stimulus, and no wage-driven inflation from low unemployment. The models and historical precedents that the Harvard trio had relied on clearly no longer apply, if they ever did, says Jamie. I don't think they ever did. They never allowed for prediction. We know that because Larry Summers is constantly making predictions, and none of them ever come true. His predictions about inflation, well, yes, there was inflation, that was true, but a lot of other people were saying there was going to be inflation. Larry Summers' theory of inflation was predicting persistent inflation until now and past now. And that has been proven to be false because inflation has been falling. There also has been no recession, unemployment has not risen, and higher interest rates have not deterred business investment. Residential construction took a hit, but the construction center overall soon shook that off, and the banking crisis earlier this year has not led to financial contagion. It's true that a recession remains possible, of course, but so far there are very few warning signs. These happy circumstances have led some observers to congratulate Powell and the Fed on achieving a, quote, soft landing, unquote, but crediting the Fed as magical thinking. There is no way under any theory or precedent that rate hikes beginning in January 2022 could have knocked back inflation by July of the same year, which is what happened in 2022. Whatever its consequences down the road, the Fed's policy tightening has been irrelevant to the inflation slowdown so far. Well, why is that? Jamie asked the question, why haven't 18 months of rising interest rates had any perceptible effect on employment, investment, or growth? That is, the perceptible effect was supposed to be to slow employment, investment, and growth. That is as much of a puzzle for progressives as the fall of inflation is for the Austerians. The Austerians being Rogoff and Furman and Summers. Especially considering that the pandemic, that is all three are neoliberals, I should make clear, considering that the pandemic-driven boost to household savings has ended, and Congress has started cutting back fairly modestly on various spending programs. Part of the answer surely lies in new tax incentives for investment, notably in semiconductors and renewable energy. But those sectors are fairly small, and their growth will have accounted for perhaps 100,000 jobs. Very quantitative there, just 100,000 jobs, when there have been millions of jobs created. Another part of the answer may lie in direct investment by companies fleeing Europe's industrial decline, itself a byproduct of sanctions, against Russia. And I might add here the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is certainly getting direct investment by German companies here. and actually starting to move their production here because they won't have to pay such high energy costs if they do going on. But again, these numbers cannot be very large. What else is going on? One factor suggested to me by Robert Alibur, an emeritus professor of economics and international finance at the University of Chicago, is that the top quarter of U.S. households became cash rich during the pandemic. These households represent the largest share of U.S. purchasing power, and their spending is largely immune to high interest rates. One other suggestion comes from Warren Mosler, the godfather of modern monetary theory, MMT, who notes that U.S. national debt has risen to nearly 130% of GDP, up from 60% in the early 2000s. The net interest paid on that debt increased by 35% from 2021 to 2022, reaching 2% of GDP. And about 70% of those payments, the interest payments, went to the U.S. private sector. If one adds the effective interest paid starting in 2008 on $3 trillion in bank reserves, the fiscal support through this channel, the interest channel, has been substantial. Now, this is something Mike Norman, another one of the MMTers, who has a program on trading, MMT-based trading, he'll tell you that almost every day of the week, that the interest channel is extremely important in stimulating the U.S. economy right now. And that is what has been keeping the economy up there in spite of the fact that the Fed has been raising rates. All the raising rates is doing is putting more money into the private sector. It's not coming so much from deliberate fiscal action, okay, on the part of Congress. It's coming from fiscal support in the form of increased interest being paid by the Treasury Department on debt. History supports Warren Mosler's conjecture, says Jamie. Back in 1981, U.S. federal debt was only about 30% of GDP. Much of it was in fixed interest, long-term bonds with no interest paid on bank reserves. As a result, then Fed Chair Paul Volcker's shocking large interest rate increases mostly hit private debtors and business investment, and the offsetting fiscal boost from interest payments was small because the level of debt was only 30% of GDP. In contrast, when the federal debt exceeded 100% of GDP in 1946, almost all of it was in war bonds held by U.S. households. Despite yielding only 2% in interest, those bonds provided a boost to private incomes and a base for mortgage borrowing through the 1950s, a time of largely stable middle-class prosperity. The, quote, fiscal channel, unquote, for interest rate payments is an inconvenient concept for those who wring their hands over the burden of public debt. Who are these people who wring their hands over the burden of public debt? They are the neoliberals, of course, including people like Powell, including people like the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, including people like Summers and Rogoff and Furman, and millions of other people who wring their hands over the burden of public debt. It suggests, going on with Jamie's, it suggests that Powell's rate hikes may be powerless to slow GDP. Indeed, additional rate increases could even be expansionary, at least up to a point. Yeah, I think if they kept on raising it to Volcker's level, with this level of debt, if it were 21 and 22%, it probably would crash the economy. But you'd have to go that high, not just to the roughly 5.25% we're at now. As in other extreme cases, like Argentina, where interest payments amount to a quarter or more of GDP, wow, rate hikes will increase costs for businesses. pushing up prices, and also apply price pressures on fixed assets, land, such as land, minerals, and oil. That will show up in our inflation measures. That in turn will discourage saving, spur borrowing, and impel the Fed to raise rates even more. Over time, this process will lead towards economic chaos. But if this narrative has merit and high interest rates don't bring on the recession that the Fed so clearly desires, it will be difficult to change course. Ideology and habit can nurture the hope that doubling down on an ineffective policy will make it work. What might stop this dynamic? One answer is severe fiscal austerity with budget cuts used to provoke the recession that interest rates have failed to bring about. We are already seeing pressure for this option from Wall Street. Last week, Fitch downgraded its credit rating on U.S. sovereign debt. By the way, I covered that. I covered how stupid that was in a move clearly timed. Well, maybe not so stupid if the purpose of it was to scare Congress as its budget deadlines approach. Such a policy shift, if it is strong enough, would complete the ongoing obliteration of the American middle class. Obviously, it would be better to do the opposite, to empower the middle class and disempower the bankers. That would mean cutting interest rates while regulating new credit flows, controlling strategic prices. How do you do that? Through price controls, strategic prices, and strengthening fiscal support for household incomes and well paying jobs. People with decent and secure incomes can reduce their reliance on unstable loans. That's a prescription there in a little paragraph. Obviously, I'll repeat that, it would be better to do the opposite, to empower the middle class and disempower the bankers. That's what should have been done in 2008 also. The opposite, of course, was done, to empower the bankers and drive the mortgage holders out of their homes. In the Obama administration in 2009, 2010, it was about saving the bankers and screwing the people. That's exactly what it was about. Jamie was advocating doing the opposite then too. He hasn't changed since 2009. Hasn't changed a bit. I think the theory of inflation has changed, actually more than a bit, because now the MMTers emphasize constantly the interest rate channel for putting money into the economy, which is that's really a fairly recent emphasis, okay, of MMT thinkers. But that's definitely a change, an important change in the theory of inflation that has come about, okay, over years. But as Jamie says here, after disempower the bankers, that would mean cutting interest rates. And again, the MMT notion concerning interest rates is that the natural rate of interest is zero. That is the federal funds rate, natural rate of interest, okay, is zero. And that the Federal Reserve should keep it at zero by leaving excess reserves in the system. That could be done easily. It could be done starting tomorrow and would quickly happen. Then the government and the Federal Reserve could regulate new credit flows, control strategic prices, and strengthen fiscal support for household incomes and well paying jobs. How could that be done? Federal job guarantee, direct payments, direct income payments to households. Both of those can be done. People with decent and secure incomes can reduce their reliance on unstable loans, credit card loans. That would be wonderful, by the way. That would be wonderful. Oh, by the way, this link to well paying jobs, it is a link to Pavlina Chernyeva's book, The Case for a Job Guarantee. So Jamie has become a proponent of the job guarantee in 2023. That's interesting because back in 2010, he was not a proponent of the federal job guarantee. So the MMTers have brought him over a period of time. I remember this blog I did, it was in 2010, 2011, where I critiqued the opposition of Jamie to the job guarantee. Sometimes he reads my stuff, but I don't believe that changed his mind. I think it was the work, continuing work on the job guarantee done by the MMTers and very much by Pavlina. Anyway, the final sentence of this. That is what we ought to do. But as Jamie says, but don't hold your breath. Because when do the neoliberals in this government ever do what they ought to do? When are they ever right? Obviously, this article by Jamie shows that they were wrong on inflation. They're still wrong on inflation. They're wrong on inflation every day. They were wrong on inflation, what was it, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, when Jay Powell raised the interest rates by another quarter of a point, even though inflation had been going down, he raised it by another quarter of a point because he's stuck with this idea that the only way to bring inflation under control is to raise interest rates. And by the way, early in 2022, before they started hiking interest rates, maybe it was in 2021 that Jay Powell did this, he admitted that the Federal Reserve had no good theory of inflation. They had no valid theory. But they still insisted on using this tool of hiking interest rates, which is not backed by a valid economic theory. Because that's what neoliberals do. If they have a doubt about anything, they immediately turn to austerity. That's why we call them the Austerians. Now, the third article I want to talk about here tonight starts getting into what happens when we listen to the Austerians. And so let me share that piece. Because it's very interesting in this context. More people die young in the United States from Truth Out due to health care and welfare cuts, study finds. By the time COVID-19 hit, about 600,000 more people in the United States were dying each year compared to its peer nations. This is by Mike Ludwig of Truth Out, published August 8th, 2023. There's a graphic. Truth Out is a vital news source in the living history of political struggle. If you think our work is valuable, support us with a donation of any size. Truth Out and a number of other very good publications having trouble raising money right now. Of course, I also am having trouble raising money right now. So, please buy me a coffee. Please go to my Patreon account occasionally. Anyway, going on with the article, from 1930 through the middle of the last century, the mortality rate in the United States was lower or commensurate with the mortality rate of other wealthy nations, such as Canada, France, and Britain. However, in the late 1970s through the 1980s, U.S. health outcomes and mortality rates began to diverge from those of its peers. By 2021, about half of all U.S. deaths under the age of 65 would have been avoided if the U.S. mortality rates were on a par with those of other countries, according to a new study published by the National Academy of Sciences. In other words, on average, 1 out of every 2 deaths under the age of 65 in the United States would be averted in countries like Australia, Germany, Japan, or Portugal. By the time COVID-19 hit, about 600,000 more people in the U.S. were dying each year than scientists would expect if mortality rates were equal to those of peer countries. COVID-19 then sent the number of excess deaths, quote unquote, that exceed expected mortality rates skyrocketing. Study author Jacob Bohr, an assistant professor of global health and epidemiology, Boston University School of Public Health, said the media focused on drops in life expectancy during the COVID pandemic. Excuse me a second, folks. I have a couple of pills I need to take. But the study puts life expectancy data in the context of, quote, what that actually means and how poorly we're doing compared to other places, unquote. Quote, life expectancy doesn't apply to an individual, it applies to a population, unquote, Bott said, in a statement. Quote again, our data is a counterfactual. It gives us a sense of just how much life is being lost, unquote. He might have added, due to our policies, due to our neoliberal policies. Life expectancy measures the average number of years people live in a specific population. 2021, the United States had the lowest life expectancy among the wealthiest nations for people assigned male or female at birth, 73 years for males and 79 years for females, respectively. Why aren't we in the streets about this? Surely this indicates a failure of public policy compared to what they're doing in other nations. Both parties are responsible for this. Neoliberals in both parties are responsible for this. The neoliberal takeover of the United States is responsible for this. Before COVID, the U.S. was experiencing, by the way, I have to add at this point, austerity kills. We've known that for a very long time. I've been saying it for years. Others have been saying austerity is murder. It's true. We need to be in the streets about this. We need to be defeating Congresspeople about this, ending their congressional careers. We need to be ending senators' careers. We need to be kicking out our presidents as long as they're not doing anything about this. Why are we such suckers? Why are we letting our governments give us the lowest life expectancy among the wealthiest nations. Why are we doing that? It's because we've accepted the ideas of neoliberalism and the policies of the neoliberals. Before COVID, going back to the article, the United States was experiencing an improvement in life expectancy, though not at the same pace, as its peer nations. But while other nations saw life expectancy decline and then rebound to modern levels over the course of the pandemic, COVID 19 erased any slight growth in life expectancy the U.S. had seen in 2 decades. The result is that in the US, more people simply die younger than in other countries. Bohr and his team call these deaths, quote, missing Americans, unquote, to illustrate the number of lives that are, quote, lost, unquote. When US mortality rates are compared to other countries, to do this, the researchers compared the number of deaths recorded in the US to the average number of recorded deaths of 21 wealthy nations going back to the 1930s. By the 1980s, the number of excess deaths in the US was growing larger each year. In the 1980s, Republican President Ronald Reagan slashed federal spending on Medicaid and other public health and safety net programs while deregulating the healthcare industry. The most notorious neoliberal president did that. Ron Reagan. Quote, by Reaganomics coincided with the U.S. diverging from peer countries in terms of health outcomes. But that didn't stop President Donald Trump and other Republicans from pursuing similar policies. What is this about Republicans? I mean, the Democrats have been pursuing similar policies too. It's not just the Republicans, all the neoliberals. I mean, what about Biden? Ending the COVID emergency. Ending the COVID emergency. And kicking, I don't know how many millions off of Medicaid. The study notes that, quote, of missing Americans, unquote, is a statistical construct that, quote, cannot specify which deaths would have been averted, only the number that would have been averted if the United States had mortality rates of its peers. Quote, the U.S. policy environment is the big story, unquote, Bohr said. Quote, this data shines a light on the ways all groups are suffering. Before the pandemic and after, related to systemic gaps in the social safety net that are really quite different in the U.S. compared to other nations, unquote. One of the most glaring systemic gaps is health coverage. And Bohr said he was struck by how many people in the U.S. die earlier in life compared to other countries where health care is universal or heavily subsidized. He might have added, or both. The U.S. has public insurance programs that can provide health care for low-income adults and children, disabled people, and the elderly, but not for hundreds of millions of adults under the age of 65. The number of uninsured adults shrank under the Affordable Care Act as more people accessed marketplace plans, but subsidized health coverage is often slim, and 12% of adults under the age of 65 were uninsured in 2019 with COVID right around the corner. Quote, it doesn't have to be that way. We have Medicare and Social Security after age 65. We have reasonable programs for children, Bohr said. And quote again, it's working age adults that we leave to their own devices. force them to privately insure for Medicare and bear all the risks themselves: housing, violence, foods, environmental exposures. Healthcare coverage. Healthcare coverage is not the only hole. Thanks, honey. Bonnie gave me something to look at. Oh, screwed that up.
Gilbert.
Uh,
Gilbert.
yeah, I was aware of that. That's me saying that I would use it tonight. Okay. Healthcare coverage is not the only hole in the U.S. safety net, of course. The pandemic laid bare the cruel realities of economic inequality and a chronically underfunded public health system, with low income and black and brown people bearing a disproportionate burden of COVID's impact as life expectancy dropped, fatal drug overdoses increased, and the virus claimed more than 1 million lives while leaving others with long term complications. And plenty of those others with long term complications don't have health insurance. Bohr said plenty of research has documented disproportionate impact of the pandemic among frontline workers or Black and Native American people, for example. But white people in the U.S. are often the reference category in those studies that non-white demographics are compared to. However, that group, white Americans, accounts for the majority of, quote, excess deaths, unquote, and is doing much worse relative to people living in other countries. Quote, we're comparing black people to a group that's already not doing well compared to peer nations, unquote, Bohr said. The study looks at mortality rates through 2021, and despite a Democrat in the White House, the nation has continued to take steps in the wrong direction. The Supreme Court overturned the right to abortion in 2022, and red states responded by placing dangerous bans that are harming pregnant people. By the way, all the pregnant people are women, huh? An estimated 2.1 million people, including children, are estimated to have recently lost their health coverage in post-pandemic purges of Medicaid rolls. Private insurance is expensive, and the industry is not known for being customer friendly. About 60% of Americans report having problems with their health insurance over the past year. While physicians and researchers roundly criticized health policies pushed by Trump both before and after COVID hit, the new study suggests public health and quality of life in the U.S. began a marked decline relative to other countries during the Reagan administration. The maelstrom of death and policy disputes followed COVID-19 were a predictable result of decades of divestment in the health of the U.S. population, not to mention the administration that was in charge when the virus arrived. Quote, it is not a coincidence that the U.S. had the highest mortality impact of COVID relative to other nations and the worst mortality rates pre-COVID, unquote, Bohr said. So, who was the author of this article again? Mike Ludwig of Truth Out. I'd forgotten that. August 8th, 2023. So, I said the key topic tonight was the wrongness of the neoliberals, okay, and their policies. We covered what we covered is the wrongness of their position on Social Security. the wrongness of their battle to contain inflation and their wrongness in ending the COVID emergency and cutting millions of people off of the Medicaid rolls, and their wrongness in pursuing austerity policies from the Reagan administration up to the present. Democrats and Republicans alike, neoliberals in both parties. Sure, Reagan and Bush, but also Clinton and Bush 43, and Obama, and Trump, and now Biden. Not keeping the COVID emergency in place when he could have, when he should have. And also not invoking Section 1881, I believe it is, of the Social Security Act, which allows him, in a situation of emergency, to extend Medicare to all the people of the United States. He could have done that. But he's a neoliberal through and through. And he would not do that. And the resulting austerity is killing people right now, as we speak. D, what say you?
I remember when Clinton, after he was in office, he went around Europe with his neoliberalism talks.
He did.
And speeches. I remember that, and his daughter, was in the audience a lot of times with him talking about neoliberalism. So Clinton was just so into it and really believed it.
Yes, and not just Bill, Hillary too.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, Chelsea too.
Yeah, she was brought up in it, and she was brought in. Obviously, those are her parents, and she's always been very loyal to her parents. Her parents' views and whatever. She never separated from what their views are. Because I remember, what's his name? Now I can't think of his name, but he was in the same circles growing up, and he separated himself as he got older, had his own viewpoints, whereas Chelsea, has kept the views of her parents and stays within that web.
Yes. The ideas, of neoliberalism ran through and through our country from the middle of the 1970s up to the present. And it's those ideas and the policies that followed that are responsible for our lowered life expectancy now, and for the missing Americans that Boer talks about. We have to remember.
And it just seems that these people can't look at, okay, this is what the policies are, this is the charts, this is what we're supposed to do with the neoliberalism. But they're not looking at what it's doing to the country and to the people. It's like they're just looking at charts and paperwork, but not the effect on the population.
No. Not looking at the effects, on the population. And being wrong on the economics also. They're just wrong about it. They don't understand how federal finance works here in the United States.
No.
They do not understand it. And as a result, they don't use the policy space we have to increase the well being of the American people. They only use that policy space to fight wars, but they won't use it for us.
Okay, the person's name I remembered is Max Blumenthal. Growing up, he grew up around with Chelsea Clinton. His parents were very influential in Washington. So he was within the circles, and how he has his own mindset away from what he grew up around, and she kept in it.
Yes, in fact, I have this thinking that his father's name was also Max Blumenthal.
Yes.
Okay, and he was the Max Blumenthal who was running around supporting Hillary to the hilt. I mean, during that period, he was like tied to Hillary's apron strings all the time.
Yeah.
And so his son is completely different,
Yes. His son
completely
has his own
opposite,
mind.
and completely rejects the whole of neoliberalism.
Yes.
Okay, Kay Ryan points out that her payment from Social Security is only $800 a month, far from a socially inclusive retirement payment. Far from that, because of neoliberalism.
Right. Shame. Shame on our government. Shame on the government.
Shame on our politicians.
Yes.
But we know how to cure the problem.
We do, if only they would do it. If only we can get rid of them all.
If only we can dump the corruption.
Exactly. Put them in a dumpster.
If only we can get people to follow the rule, to
Hmm.
join the movement to dump the corruption. The cost of living does depend on where you live, as Steve Wolfbrand says. Steve says, learn to code so that artificial intelligence can steal your job in 2 years. Kay says, yes, Steve, AI is a good thing. Oh, I'm sorry, AI is a bad thing. There are many reasons why AI is a bad thing, and there are many reasons why it can be a good thing. But it can't be a good thing until we dump the corruption, okay, in the federal government, because unless we dump it, the people who run our government are not going to do good things for us because they're bought by the donors. So we are coming back to dump the corruption once again. Okay, any other comments, Dee?
When we start talking about the Peterson and Summers and all of them, I always think back to Obama, his administration with them there, constantly with those meetings. And it's infuriating, and this stuff has just gotta stop.
I know. It's dragged us down for decades now. And of course, in the Obama administration, it certainly dragged us down. When okay, there was a proposal made to have a fiscal commission. Congress would not vote for the proposal. It was defeated in Congress. So Peter G. Peterson said to Obama that he would fund it okay, if Obama would appoint the fiscal commission. And so Obama did. And Peter G. Peterson funded the fiscal commission because he wanted to see the austerity policies take root in full flower. So he spent millions of his own money on the fiscal commission when Congress would not actually fund it. Peterson was doing all kinds of things to get the government in the years following the great crash of 2008. He was doing all kinds of things to encourage austerity policies, okay, on the part of the government.
Mhm.
The MMT conference that I and a few others created on April 28th, 2010, was intended to be a counter conference to this Peterson conference advocating for the importance, okay, of austerity on that very same day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the MMTers have won a lot of ground, okay, since then. I think the debate over MMT is now in the mainstream, and there's a good basis for the final defeat of the Austerians, though it may
Mm-hmm.
take another 10 years. I continue to maintain that it would not have taken 10 years if someone had minted the $100 trillion coin. That would have dispelled austerity immediately as a viable policy option.
So instead, we're stuck with a shithole country.
Yeah, and an increasingly shithole country. Okay, and a country that by trying to impose austerity and create austerity in other countries as part of a neoliberal foreign policy has resulted in the world increasingly turning against us.
Mm-hmm.
Now
Yeah, definitely.
we have a serious revolution in Africa starting up. Also, Latin America, okay, is turning against us. And I have to believe that Europe's going to turn against us too, as soon as the governments that have been supporting, okay, the Ukraine war, as soon as they have new elections and people start running on the destruction of the pipeline, I think many countries in Europe are going to turn against us then as well.
Oh, I think so too. Now we got the U.S., as we talked about last night on my show, the U.S. provoking the Persian Gulf.
Yes. Yeah, the provocations in the Persian Gulf. Very, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. Okay, let's leave it here for tonight. Okay, I think that's enough. And we'll be back with some good shows tomorrow night.
Yes, we will. Please
We,
hit the like button, subscribe, and share.
and please go to our Buy Me a Coffee accounts and buy me some coffee, please. Buy Dee some coffee.
I love coffee.
We work hard and we need some coffee. Please do.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, folks.
Thank you and good night. And good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
Yeah, good night, Dee.
Thank you. Good night.